of the most terrifying adjective or descriptor phrase you know that describes a looming calamity? Chances are they've all been used at one point or another to describe the global climate emergency. We are careening towards a climate catastrophe, a crisis of unimaginable scale. The era of global boiling is upon us, just some of the recent iterations. But where the rubber hits the road, global leaders putting their money where their mouth is, well, that's quite a challenge. Imagine having a crisis that everyone agrees is existential in nature and whose impact already accounts for tens of thousands of deaths every year. Yet, action seems to be slow in coming. Welcome to G20 Focus. I'm Thulasizwe Simelane. G20 countries have one feature in common: either most industrialized in the world or in their region, or emerging economies of global significance. But here's another feature they share. Together, they account for more than 80% of the global greenhouse gas emissions that contribute to devastating climate change. Imagine if these 19 sovereign states and 2 country blocs began to steer the ship decisively away from calamity. But that's easier said than done, as we'll find out over the course of the next hour. We are exactly 40 days away from the G20 Leaders Summit in Johannesburg. Let me give you the example of South Africa. The country continues to see the most catastrophic floods that lead to the loss of many lives and wreak havoc to billions worth of property and livelihoods. We are not alone, though, experiencing these sustained natural disasters. The 2024 AU-UNDP Climate Finance in Africa report confirms that climate change has managed to significantly alter the natural world. The report also indicates that its global damage to farming, infrastructure, productivity, and health will cost an estimated $38 trillion per year by 2050 and see a 19% reduction in income. In Africa, this could be as high as 30%, a stark reminder of how the impact of climate change is experienced unevenly across the world. So the continent of Africa is the most affected by climate change, as we all know, while contributing the least to the causes, the historical causes of climate change. So in the context of the need to reverse these natural disasters through, among others, decarbonizing economies, while also under pressure to grow those economies, in this episode we ask, is climate justice achievable? And joining us for that discussion are in studio Dorah Modise, the Executive Director of the Presidential Climate Commission, Richard Worthington, who represents both Project 90 by 2030, as well as the African Civil Network on the G20. And of course, we are also joined virtually by Maesela Kekana, who is the DDG for Climate Change and Air Quality from the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment. But before we get into the discussion, for context, let's watch this clip of President Cyril Ramaphosa during his recent address at the United Nations General Assembly in New York a couple of weeks ago.
Climate change is an existential threat. We are failing future generations by our inability to reduce global warming. Climate change is reversing economic growth and development gains in many countries, especially in the global south. Although Africa carries the least responsibility for climate change, many countries on the continent of Africa experience much of its harshest effects. Extreme weather events like floods and droughts are driving food insecurity, displacing populations, causing damage to infrastructure, and leading to the unnecessary loss of livelihoods. Member states must honor their undertakings and commitments in line with the guiding principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities.
The executive director of the United Nations Environmental Program predicted that by the year 2000, climate change would cause a global catastrophe. He said that it will be irreversible, as any nuclear holocaust would be. This is what they said at the United Nations. What happened? Here we are. Another UN official stated in 1989 that within a decade, entire nations could be wiped off the map by global warming. Not happening. You know, it used to be global cooling. If you look back years ago in the 1920s and the 1930s, they said, global cooling will kill the world. We have to do something. Then they said global warming will kill the world. But then it started getting cooler, so now they could just call it climate change, because that way they can't miss. It's climate change. Because if it goes higher or lower, whatever the hell happens, there's climate change. It's the greatest con job ever perpetrated on the world, in my opinion. Climate change, no matter what happens, you're involved in that. No more global warming, no more global cooling. All of these predictions made by the United Nations and many others, often for bad reasons, were wrong. And I'm telling you that if you don't get away from the green energy scam, your country is going to fail. And if you don't stop people that you've never seen before, that you have nothing in common with, your country is going to fail. The carbon footprint is a hoax made up by people with evil intentions, and they're heading down a path of total destruction.
Yeah, so that's just a sampling and a flavor of just how complicated the discussions around climate change at the G20 Leaders Summit are likely to be. Just those two contrasts between what President Ramaphosa was saying at the same stage with the US President, the next president of the G20, Donald Trump there. Let me bring it back to my guests in studio. Richard, I want to start with you, because while you were listening to Donald Trump there, I could see you wincing a little bit. It was uncomfortable listening, was it?
Well, do you have to remind us what an idiot we have in charge of the most powerful country in the world? It's really disconcerting that he's so blatant about his choice of ignorance. Yeah. You know, he doesn't even try to put through a credible account, and his misrepresentation of what is said by the United Nations, as opposed to a couple of officials that might have got carried away, is absolutely egregious. Yeah. So anybody who gives any credibility to what he says is at danger of misunderstanding the United Nations, which has a lot of shortcomings. We need reform of the UN itself if we're going to achieve climate justice. But you know, we don't get that by having people spreading misleading narratives that not only are in denial about science and the science of climate, but also about our international institutions. Yeah. So it's very disconcerting.
Yeah. DDG Kekana, let me bring you into the conversation. Let's start with conceptual definitions, what we are talking about. I think between yourselves and Dorah Modise, you've had plenty of time to work through narrowing down and refining the definitions of what we're talking about when we talk about climate change and how it fits in within the G20 conversation. What are we talking about? To people such as the US president and people that perhaps listen to him and hear him and believe him, what is this climate change we're talking about, and why does it matter in the context of the G20 leadership?
Thank you. Thulasizwe, good evening to your viewers. Climate change, as is often said by the scientists, this is the most pressing issue facing humanity today, and we should not undermine that statement. So simply put, climate change refers to long-term shifts in temperatures and weather patterns that in the long run will completely alter ecosystem that support life on the human platform. So it's the changes that you see day to day is what we refer to as weather, and the long-term shifts in temperatures really is what constitute climate change. Of course, even my granny knows about climate change. She used to tell me that things have changed. The rains no longer come on time, so I have to plant my mealies a little bit later because the rain patterns have shifted and changed. Just that she did not have the term climate change. So it is here. It is not something of a distant future.
Yeah. Dorah Modise, from your side, the fact that you are at the Presidential Climate Commission talks about the elevation of the issue to be at that level. Why that elevation? And now we're seeing similar moves by other countries, especially countries that are part of the G20.
Yes. Look, thanks, Thulasizwe. Good evening. Yeah, climate change is not an environmental issue.
Yeah.
You know, if I think back 20 years ago when I was mainly in the environment sector, and Richard would say the discussion was around, you know, where are the economists, where are the financiers, because climate change is an economic catastrophe, it's an environmental catastrophe, it's an agricultural issue, so it straddles the impacts of climate change, straddles different sectors. So therefore, for South Africa and many other countries, like you're saying, heads of states now are seeing the necessity of elevating the need to coordinate response to climate change to be at a much higher level, wherein we are able to bring in different stakeholders to the table to make sure that we've got an all of the economy and all of the society kind of solution to the problems that we currently face. So at the Presidential Climate Commission, we've got all the sectors of the economy represented. Commissioners are coming really from all sectors of the economy, and therefore even our just transition framework that says how do we decarbonize, move more towards renewables, whilst we make sure that we do not impact social systems, that the economy continues to grow, because those detractors in the space are saying, well, what about economic growth? Our growth is very much built on fossil fuel intensive energy, which is coal generation in South Africa. So if you're going to want to decommission and move away from coal, what happens to the economy? And those are the kinds of questions that we are answering, to come up with solutions that make sure that, yes, we know as a country, and the president was very clear that we do have to transition. We have a 2050 target of net zero carbon, but we have to do that in a responsible way, such that all that we are able to assist the hard to abate sectors, meaning the fossil fuel intensive sectors, such that they're able to also move at a steady pace, but at the same time also ensure that spaces and geographies that are already impacted. I mean, you would have seen the floods, you did show a clip earlier on. KZN currently, I mean, every year, multiple floods, not just KZN, I think across all provinces.
We recently had in the Eastern Cape a couple of
Exactly. So the impacts are getting, so the severity and the frequency of such disasters is increasing. So therefore, whilst we are looking at decarbonizing over time, we also need to make sure that social systems can withstand the shocks that are happening.
But who's able to talk to the science? Richard, let me turn to you. If we are saying, Donald Trump there in that clip talks about, they said it's global warming, then they said it's global cooling, and now they're saying it's climate change. We are talking about what? On an average, are we talking about the increase in global temperatures on an average?
Indeed. And
why is that a bad thing and leads to the disasters that we're describing?
Well, one needs a bit of a historical perspective, which you're obviously not going to get from that man, which is why I don't know why you put him on our TVs. But, you know, over the last 100,000 years or so, we've been in a pretty sweet spot for human, well, more than 100,000 years, but particularly the period that we know most, and through which human development has been continuing for at least 300,000 years. We have evolved in an environment that, and that's a challenging word in itself because we are part of it. You know, using the term environment suggests that it's out there and we're somehow removed from it. And that is one of the reasons we're in the crisis we're in, is because we've forgotten that we're intrinsically, nature is in us and we are part of nature. So, you know, we've had these lovely conditions from the perspective of a human animal, that have had this average temperature around 14.5 degrees. Now, energy is temperature, right? You elevate the temperature, you're elevating the energy. So if you increase our average global temperature, that is the temperature of the entire system, not just the weather in one place or another.
Yeah, not in isolated.
You know, and it's not evenly spread. Most of the heating at the moment is at the poles because of those are the coldest places, so that's where the heating goes mostly. So it doesn't show up the same all over the planet. So in some places you might get cooling when you have more energy in the climate system because of what it does to the ocean circulation, etc. But basically what this means is that we have far more energy in our climate system, which means we have more intense storms, more intense rainfalls, much greater variability and volatility. So dry periods tend to be longer. So we have far more extremes, and we have warming oceans, which are bad for the marine ecosystem. So we have depletion of fisheries.
Let me take a quick break.
Sure.
We'll pick up on that point immediately after this break. You're watching G20 Focus here on SABC News, but we're also live on SABC 2 and SABC Plus. I'll be back with that conversation in just a moment. Welcome back. This is G20 Focus. So we were just a couple of minutes ago unpacking the science behind climate change and the impacts that it has in as far as the patterns of the environment that we experience as a population, especially on the African continent. So earlier on, I alluded to Africa being most affected despite contributing the least over the decades in terms of the contributing factors to climate change. Let me show you what that looks like in terms of the impact on African countries of climate disasters, people affected by climate disasters. There you see it, the leading country with most people affected being Ethiopia with 33.1 million people. This is between 2021 and 2025. Then you see the DRC and countries such as Nigeria at 23.7 million people affected by natural disasters between 2021 and 2025, all the way to Sudan. But that's just the top 5. And this is not to say that the other countries are faring any better in terms of the impacts that they experience. So let's pick up on that point. I don't know if you want to pick up on that point, Ms. Modise, where we were just describing the science of it. The rise in the average global temperatures leading to the disasters that Richard was describing.
Yes, let me explain it in a most basic way. We have something called greenhouse gases, which is a family of gases led by carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide, we all know it as the gas that we exhale, right? Yeah. But it is a product of combustion when you are making fire. So let's think a normal fire at home. So when you take it on a macro scale in terms of our energy sources, our coal-fired power stations, they burn coal. The main product of combustion, there will be a number of gases, including carbon dioxide, which will be a major source. Also in agriculture, like cattle farming, there's also a release of methane gas, also at landfill sites and so forth. So different sources, but in this instance for South Africa, power generation being the highest. These gases, once they go up into the atmosphere, they formulate what we call like a greenhouse, a layer of gases that then locks the heat. That's where we then come to the term global warming.
Yeah, and they stay there for a long time.
Yes, they stay there for a long time. So the normal system, naturally, without our interference, us releasing these gases, the solar radiation will come into the earth and re-radiate back into space. But with these gases, you get radiation coming in. Instead of going back, it bounces back into the atmosphere. So therefore we lock the heat in, and then it affects then most of our global sort of seasonal variations is controlled by oceanic movements. So once you get a temperature rise, then you've got rise in your sea level rises that affects these movements, which will affect then the weather systems. That's in simple terms, because you can get a scientist here to give you a 2-hour lecture. But then that was the heating. That's why it was called global warming. And it's unfortunate President Trump explains it in such a simplistic way. That warming then results in these changes that will appear at different geographies in different ways. For example, in South Africa, the predictions are the eastern side will become wetter and the northwest will become drier. So you'll get droughts in certain areas, you'll get extreme rainfalls in other areas, you'll get extreme heat in other areas. It's just mainly the changes in the Earth system, and which is why we are saying it is an existential crisis, because it affects so many other systems.
And another example from South Africa is that the Mediterranean weather system, as it's called, which sits over the Western Cape, the western southern part of the Cape, which is why we have a wine industry there, etc. That whole weather system looks to be moving off the coast. So we might see the entire, the differences between further up north and up here in Gauteng and Cape Town. We have different seasonal patterns at the moment. That Cape Town pattern might move entirely off the coast. That's what seems most likely. So we're talking about major changes that will impact food production, the productivity of the oceans, and human health directly, because even a small change in ambient temperature of even less than 1 degree, and we're already well over 1 degree on the 30-year trend, on the annual trends we're over 1.5, on the annual averages, but so like bacteria in the mouths of antelope. Hundreds of thousands of buck in Africa died as a result of the activation of a bacteria that had been totally dormant for as long as human memory. But when they investigated why these hundreds of buck died, it was because of a bacterium that was activated by a small rise in ambient temperature. So the disease vectors for malaria, for a whole lot of diseases will expand with the changes in weather patterns that are very subtle.
DDG Maesela, Kekana, let me bring you back into the conversation. That's where your work comes in, isn't it? Putting shoulder to the wheel in what is a global effort, because we share this globe and the fate of the planet is the fate of all of us. Tell me how it works out within the South African context, the whole conversation around air quality control and adding to the effort to keeping the average rise in temperatures to below 1.5, I believe was the number when the Paris Agreement was signed and adopted a couple of years ago. How does it work out in the South African space?
Well, in South Africa, we do have a number of strategies, and now we even have what you call the Climate Change Act, right? So that is how we look at this issue. And the second part is that as South Africa, we have also signed the Paris Agreement, and we are part to the UN convention that deals with this. So we have a responsibility, like all the countries that have signed to the Paris Agreement, to produce plans that seeks to deal with the issue. We call them the nationally determined contributions, or the NDCs. And we update this every 5 years. And South Africa has always submitted a plan since Paris 2015. We had our first NDC, and we updated it in 2021, so it will run up to 2030. And before Cabinet now, we have the second NDC, which will run up to 2035. And how have we performed? It's quite clear that we have achieved our targets for 2025, and we are on track to achieve the 2030 target. So each country has to put its best foot forward. That's what we are doing in South Africa. But as I said, that is one part, and the discussions usually just focus on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, the things that cause you climate change. But there's a second part to the story. Because climate change is here, you have to build resilience. Resilience of your economy, resilience of your society. So what we call adaptation. And that is very important. How do you protect your citizens? How do you protect your economy? What we call climate proofing your roads, your dams, your buildings. So we've got a number of climate change strategies, be it for the water sector, for the health sector, and so forth. And so that part of the conversation is also important, and Africa largely tend to focus on that part because, as you rightly said in your introduction, we contribute very little to this problem. So, but we are affected the most. So you have to build that resilience.
So you laid up very nicely for me that DDG, because after the break, that's exactly where we're going to go in terms of the focus of the energies, in terms of dealing with the climate crisis, what countries are doing. We'll show you, for example, what South Africa is doing and what the split is between mitigation strategies and adaptation strategies and other factors that go into that equation. That and more still to come in the next few minutes. Welcome back. Let's tell you this now. The South African government's national program to move from coal to cleaner energy sources still haunts some locals, especially those living around mining houses in Mpumalanga's Highveld region. Electricity generation accounted for 45% of the country's greenhouse gas emissions in 2020. Residents and mine workers want the transition to be managed with diligence. Before we delve into the question of whether the just energy transition is just, please watch this and then we'll pick up the conversation after that.
Coal, one of the country's top mining exports, but there's still a decline in exports and production due to the shift to renewable energy. Despite this, coal remains vital for the country's energy sector and is still a source of employment. More than 80% of our electricity generation comes from coal-fired power plants. 12 of the power stations are in Mpumalanga. Government's program to move to cleaner energy sources still threatens many, especially those working at coal mines and the communities around the mines.
In terms of South Africa moving from coal to green energy, as the people from Mpumalanga, as I stay in Mpumalanga, I don't think it's a good idea. Our people here, we depend more on the coal here, and a lot of people, bread and butters, are here in the coal in the Mpumalanga province. So in South Africa as a whole, yes, it is fine for the energy side because it's fast, I know, but a lot of people will be jobless.
The closure of that mine, those houses, most of them are now empty, dilapidated, vandalized, and local economy was somehow affected. Families, income, other kids their parents could not afford maybe to take them to school.
The shift away from fossil fuel to reduce carbon emissions, it is aimed at achieving climate goals, a vision to net zero by 2050.
When they specifically mean about the cleaning, I understand because most of the areas suffers from like pollution, and that leads to health issues. Most of the people die based on those coal mining, and I think it should be done away in terms of those.
Because the community now is not falling on sick always with lungs or TB, even children, even a small child now. If we are using the gas stove, it's better than before when we used the coal stove number 7. The other things at the afternoon, evening also, on the morning also, there was many of road dust of a stove. Because when we wake up in the morning, you can saw all the stove gas, or not gas, the stove, the coal stove is starting to be burning.
All right, so that's just a sampling of the local voices weighing in on what is a global conversation around the just energy transition. Let me bring it back to studio. Richard, let me pick it up with you. if not collocated next to change, the word climate is usually collocated next to justice, climate justice. In the context of what we just showed, the burden on developing nations versus the burden on developed nations, is just climate justice achievable? And can the G20 be the vehicle to drive that?
Two parts. Is it achievable? Absolutely yes. Although not with the crop of leaders we have as have featured on this program so far. So it's a long-term project. But climate justice is not an end state. You know, it's actually a set of principles and an approach to dealing with things that encourages a wide horizon, a broad perspective. Because if we talk about social justice, we very often focus on things like the social support net, the economy, what have you. What we're talking about here is justice that looks beyond the immediate, because climate is a long-term and enduring impact. So all of the emissions that are put out currently and are accumulating in the atmosphere are going to have negative impacts on many, many generations to come. So when we talk about climate justice, we're also talking about intergenerational justice, because those causing the problem now are not going to be living with the main impacts. Some of it is already manifesting, but the majority of the impacts follow. There's a lag. So climate justice can certainly be achieved if we embrace another slogan: system change, not climate change. Our current system is not equipped to achieve climate justice. Now, the just energy transition is a narrower kind of portion of that, and there are things we can do within the energy transition that will advance justice, but not if we're backward looking. And too often the phrase just energy transition is being used to support a backward looking justification for no change. It's like, well, unless you can guarantee that you can change the energy system without having any negative impacts on the people who currently benefit from the current energy system, then we shouldn't do it. But we don't have justice currently. So climate justice is going to be a gradual and long-term project, but it is certainly achievable if we are prepared to question economic orthodoxy and embrace changes, including to the global financial architecture and including to the way that production is controlled, technologies are mediated. These have to be far more democratic if we're going to get there.
Modise, your take? Is it achievable? And as far as the financing conversation of how we finance, for example, the just energy transition, there's a question that lingers almost in the environment, where people feel as if the pressure is more on developing nations to adapt even in their energy approaches and their energy sources than it is in developed nations that contributed more. So in that context, is climate justice achievable?
Look, thanks. I agree with Richard. It's achievable, but at the moment, still very much uneven. Both at when you're looking at a global scale, but then also nationally. So, firstly, the president on the clip you played spoke about common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, right? So we all accept that we have a common cause to prevent further damage caused by climate change, and we also have a common cause to adapt to it. But because we didn't cause the problem equally, the responsibilities are differentiated, and we don't have the same capabilities. We are in developing countries, and they are also least developed countries. We did not contribute to the current catastrophe that we've seen, or we've contributed in a very minimal way. So therefore, the finance that's supposed to come in and assist us to adapt and to transition needs to come from the global south, which is the developed countries, right?
From the global north.
Global north, yes, sorry, global north. Yes, thanks for that. Yes, needs to come from the global north. At the moment, we have made progress in the global climate system, that we've got the adaptation fund, the loss and damage fund, the new quantified goals. there are pledges, so there are countries that are willing, but that's not even enough. We need probably 3 times what is currently being pledged.
Yeah.
But once those pledges come in now, let's come a bit nationally. Most of those, so we've got the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan, which is the first country platform in South Africa, which is good, quite good, that we've structured it with development partners, with different financial institutions. But most of it, it's mainly loans. There are concessional loans. There's also a very small component that is grants. But to access that finance becomes a challenge. So the uneven part that I'm talking about there for us that we've identified is that in terms of ensuring climate justice and ensuring that those that would be, and I note what Richard said earlier on, yes, those that would be heavily impacted, the gentlemen that were on the clip just now, in Mpumalanga, in wherever, they are relying on the coal mine, so forth. So in the transition, they have to benefit. Therefore, they need to enter the renewable sector or other economic activities. So therefore, for them to access that finance, it's still a long toll.
Yeah, this is where the conversations that were happening at COP29, for example, come into play, isn't it? DDG Kekana, just weigh in on this as well. In terms of the G20, the players that are there, that will be, around the table, are actually significant players in the conversation around the emissions conversation, but also in the conversations that happen at platforms such as the UN Climate Conference. How much of an opportunity does it present for South Africa to push in line with the themes that we've chosen for this G20 presidency?
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Thulasizwe. Look, from our perspective as South Africa, you can deal with the issue of climate change from 2 perspectives. You can look at the negative side of it, where you're looking at the impact, but you can also look at the opportunity side that is presented by the issues of climate change. And certainly, when we conceptualize the just transition, we had 2 aims. The first one was to address the issue of the transition risk that we are facing as a country, but also to disrupt the unjust transition because the transition is certainly underway. And therefore, coining the just transition was one way of dealing with that. And the primary aim was to help us deal with the issue of energy poverty. There's a lot of energy poverty in the country and in the continent. And therefore, we sought to come up with a concept that would deal with the whole of society, whole of economy approach, right? Because whether you are involved or not involved, the transition is happening. So the best thing you can do is to convert that to your advantage. So that is one story on the just transition.
DDG,
but from the G20 perspective...
Apologies for that, DDG. I do need to take a break. I want to pick up exactly on that point of the G20 perspective and the question of whether or not the pledges that are linked to those commitments to a just energy transition are actually coming through. But I'll pick up with you immediately after this short break. You're watching G20 Focus on SABC News, SABC2 and SABC Plus. I'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. Climate justice is the mantra as we prepare for the G20 Leaders Summit happening in South Africa in November. Here's part of the context. In terms of financing for climate adaptation as well as mitigation, that's where the conversation is. Let me show you how it's looking in terms of the sources of financing. This is a graphic sourced from the multilateral development banks that shows the sources of financing comparing low and middle income economies versus high-income economies. On the left there, you are seeing the sources mostly being public for low and middle income economies in terms of that value, 62 billion US dollars. This is for the year 2024 versus private sources. And then you start seeing the component that is from public sources becoming lower when you're looking at high income economies. This is for climate finance. And then for climate co-finance, the other mechanisms that are in play, you also see almost a similar picture where the public sources dominate for low and middle income economies, whereas private sources dominate as far as high income economies. So that's what you're looking at there. And it ties in nicely with the conversation that DDG Maesela Kekana was picking up from. You were talking there, DDG, about the role of the G20 in changing the picture that we are talking about in terms of the sources of financing. Pick up on that point, please.
Yes, you see, G20 is the most influential body. As you said, it represents about 75% global GDP. Therefore, cooperation among G20 countries can help you to solve a whole lot of this problem. And on the G20 side, we are not only looking at the issue of climate change, we are dealing with the entire set of triple planetary crisis, right, which talks to the issues of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. And certainly our working group, which is environment and climate sustainability working group, is looking at 6 priorities ranging from the climate change as we are discussing now, but the air quality that you also mentioned, the biodiversity and conservation, the issue of land degradation, desertification, drought and water sustainability, and finally, the issue of oceans and coast. So a whole set of issues that we are looking at. And with each priority issue that we are looking at, we are trying to identify areas where the G20 countries can cooperate and help us to solve all these problems that we are faced with. And in our papers, there are provisions where we are mentioning that the developed economic countries should continue to take the lead in terms of action, but also in terms of providing finance to us in the developing economic countries.
All right.
So that is how powerful the G20 is.
All right. And I want to pick up on that point immediately after the break, to pick up on the point of whether or not the pledges that we are seeing at various fora, right, including the G20. I was mentioning the UN climate conference, the COP29 that happened last year. My goodness, was that a point of contention? Who is going to finance all of this, the adaptation of developing nations? I'll pick up on that point, whether we're seeing those pledges coming through and being in play in the developing nations. That and more still to come. All right, let's pick up on the conversation as we draw towards the close of tonight's episode. Ms. Modise, let me pick up with you straight. Many people watching this at home in South Africa and other parts of the African continent will say, we hear all these great pledges at these international conferences. You guys are talking about getting to $300 billion per year by 2035 in terms of financing. But is it happening?
It is actually happening, Thulasizwe, but like I said, not at a scale that we would have wanted it to. But our just energy transition pledges of 12.9 billion, that is happening, and resources are being put to the different projects. But however, what I wanted to touch on is, we've got significant amounts of local funds. So the PCC just concluded what we call the finance landscape report, climate finance landscape report, and we found that from it's up to 2023, we have received 70% of our climate financing from local sources. And 30% is from global sources. So a total amount is around 130 billion on financing. 70% of that went to renewable energy projects. That might have been pushed by, yes, the climate change transitions, but maybe also around energy security. As a smaller component to adaptation and resilience. But what's encouraging there is the biggest component is coming from private financing. So the private financial sector, over and above the multilateral development banks and the national development banks like the DBSA, are also coming to the party and financing. So maybe just in short to say that we are seeing flows of climate financing, not yet enough, but it's encouraging to see that multiple actors are coming together.
Parting shots to you, Richard. How do we ensure that, one, we gain momentum through the G20 platform, which largely works on consensus and political will, as opposed to the more structured international conferences based on treaties and conventions and the likes?
Well, I'm afraid the current G20 is probably more going to be a matter of damage control than raising ambition, given the dynamics we have globally at the moment. But one thing South Africa can do is be more ambitious in its own commitments. You know, the draft commitments we've seen are very disappointing. The Presidential Climate Commission recommended a pretty decent mitigation objective for 2035. It was still a bit high in the view of some scientists, but it was reconcilable with the overall Paris goal, whereas the target that the department put forward in its draft, which appears to be going through, is really lacking. So South Africa could do more in mitigation and adaptation. You know, it is past time that we got electricity to all our people. You cannot build climate resilience if people don't even have basic electricity, information and communications technology. So I think at the moment we would like to see South Africa lead by example, but also push agendas to address illicit financial flows, that is profits being illicitly taken out of the country, and to address the expectations of the private sector to always be guaranteed a profit when they're being approached to invest in public goods. So we really do need system change, and the G20 isn't going to bring that. Part of our problem is that some of the things that should be addressed at the United Nations, because they affect all nations, are instead addressed by the richest 20 countries, and that in itself is a symptom of a lack of an approach that views all people as equally, as of equal merit.
DDG Kekana, parting shots from you in about 30 seconds or so.
Well, let me say this. The quality and the amount of climate finance that we are seeing being made available to developing countries is quite disappointing. It is pushing us more into debt, and we need a restructuring and a rethinking of non-debt instruments that can work for us. For now, it's not enough.
All right, let's leave it there. What a strong word to end it on. Thank you for joining us. This has been G20 Focus. Join us again next week when we focus on energy security as one of the themes and strands and threads that we are pulling at ahead of the G20 Leaders Summit. But for now, cheers. Take care.